particularly for the underemployed. We also are thinking about green jobs in emerging sectors, the challenges, threats, and opportunities for low-income workers in the face of digital advances. We'll think about the proliferation of contract work and insecure employment, the issues relating to affordability of housing and childcare, and of course, structural racism, gender-based discrimination, and other forms of exclusion from opportunity. To kick us off, I wanted to ask my friend and colleague, Professor Olga Hahn, to start us off here. Olga is an associate professor of strategy and entrepreneurship and the faculty director of the Center for Sustainable Enterprise and Sustainability at Keenan Flagler Business School at the University of North Carolina, where she is a distinguished fellow. She earned her PhD from Duke. She has a master's in management research from the University of Oxford, another master's in economics from the Plekhanov Russian University of Economics. Her research interests include corporate social responsibility, sustainability, international business, and she's working now on issues related to how business respond to ESG imperatives, including racial inequality, the Me Too movement, and LGBTQ plus issues. Olga, you've recently written in your paper with Yanis Ianu that the remediation of inequality is a centerpiece of the agenda for this century. Can you tell us a little bit about that and about your research in this area?
Thank you, Anita, and good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me share my slides. Can you see them? Okay, excellent. So thank you for this opportunity to share, and I know Anita tasked me with two key questions that I am aiming to answer and also get through my research. So the first question was, what is the relationship between economic inequality and economic growth? And so I'll start there, although I have to say I'm definitely not an expert in this field. As you're all aware, this question is usually looked through the prism of political economy and macro country level studies, where inequality could impair growth if those with low income suffer poor health and as a result low productivity. It could also seed the seeds of crisis, right? So I'm certainly not an expert in that field, and there's actually a very good piece in The Economist that kind of summarized existing research that I'm going to put in the chat before I forget. I'm going to quickly go over that piece and show you one graph that essentially summarizes that research as a starting point in our discussion. Then I'll demonstrate some of my research in this field, and then I answer the second question that Anita also posed as to what potential solutions exist at this intersection. So in a 2011 paper, economists at the International Monetary Fund, Andrew Berg and Jonathan Ostry, they actually argued that it's not even growth that's most important for long-run economic performance, but the spells of growth. And so getting an economy growing in the first place is much easier than actually keeping the growth spell rolling. And so they estimate that when growth weakens, inequality is often the cause, right? So there is this direct relationship. For example, if you take Latin America and the Gini index, which, as you know, it ranges from 0, representing perfect equality, to 100, where all of the income goes to one person. So in Latin America, the Gini index is about 50, and it's well above Asia, which is usually around 40. And if Latin America were to close half of that gap in inequality, its typical growth spurt might actually last twice as long on average. And as we all know, one way to decrease inequality is to redistribute wealth through taxes and transfers. And so this chart in particular provides Ginis for both the net income after taxes and those transfers and the market income, or that measure of inequality. And so the difference between the two gives us a measure of redistribution. And so in America, which does relatively little of it, redistribution trims the Gini index by about 10 points. And then Sweden, in comparison, the difference is 23 points, right? Like more than half of the US. So using these figures, economists can separate out those different effects of redistribution and inequality on growth. And so the authors find that governments in more unequal countries redistribute more, and rich economies do more than poor ones. As a result, these differences in inequality across rich countries are mostly down to the generosity of redistribution. So for example, Germany is more unequal than Britain before redistribution, but much less so after. And up to a point, spreading this wealth carries no growth penalty. So growth in income per person is not meaningfully lower in countries with more redistribution. But economies that redistribute a lot may enjoy shorter growth spells. And so when this gap between the market and the net Ginies is 13 points or more, as in a lot of Western Europe, further redistribution actually shrinks the typical expansion. So why am I bringing this up? So all of this is really to say that inequality is more closely correlated with low growth, and a high Gini for net income after redistribution corresponds to slower growth in income per person. And so in this study in particular, they essentially actually show that a distribution that reduces inequality might actually boost growth, right? So we've found an answer essentially to that first question as to what is the relationship, and we know inequality is bad. Now, let me look at the role of organizations, something that I actually study and something that we all in strategy field are concerned about as it comes to inequality. So there's this new piece, and it's from the editor in Academy of Management Review piece that essentially tries to draw our attention as academics and study the role of organizations in addressing inequality. And the first one, which is viewing organizations as those social and political actors, right, which both the society and the governments pay attention to, that could address or at least make open statements around these issues, whether it's in response to the Me Too movement or Black Lives Matter movement, and actually as a result, generate some policies and some impact, right? That is the one role that they play. And then the second role, which is, other scholars I'm more familiar with, is viewing organizations as those value creators and distributors, right? And then some industries in particular, you don't think of them as value creators necessarily, but more as value extractors, right? And how they redistribute that value that they extracted from natural resources, let's say, and by engaging in some actions like tax avoidance, what that can generate for both inequality and growth is questionable, right? And so I wanted to show you a study that I've done with my colleague at UNC. She's in the communications department, and we wanted to see, so me coming from strategy and trying to understand those trade-offs, right, that companies face when they try to decide whether they should play a role as a social political actor and engage in this corporate sociopolitical activism on inequality issues. And her as a communications scholar trying to understand what is it that even communicated when issues of this nature take place. And so, needless to say, one of the crucial 2020 tipping point moments that resulted in the wave of corporate sociopolitical activism took place on May 25th, and when African-American man George Floyd died in the hands of Minneapolis police officers. And that resonated across the world, not just across the United States of America. And so essentially what we wanted to find out is, first of all, looking at the Fortune 500 firms, right, that we all follow, there is a lot of expectations from these companies. What did they do in response to this exogenous shock, right? How did they respond? Did they put out a statement? How quickly did they put out a statement? Through what channel? Seeing that essentially within the first 2 months, majority of those that spoke up, and I should say it's about half of Fortune 500, a little bit less than half, they spoke up in the first 2 months. Then we wanted to see what was actually in those statements. What pledges did they make? How did they view inequality in this particular context? And more importantly, to analyze the trade-offs, right? How did investors, how did the market analysts, et cetera, react to these statements? Because if they reacted positively, clearly that would signal that there is a financial benefit to not just putting out the statements, but to addressing inequality for these Fortune 500 firms. And I have to say, we also want to see what the general public reactions were, but we're still in the process of analyzing that data. So I'll show you very quickly kind of the results, what we learned, just so you're aware. Like I said, a little bit less than half of Fortune 500 firms spoke up. And it was actually bigger companies with more common shares and greater total skew. 99 of Fortune 500 firms made a pledge. And here is important to understand that some of them just donated money to some organizations that are essentially trying to address this inequality. But there were also others like JP Morgan Chase, for example, here, where you look at their pledge that seems, 1.75 billion, it seems an incredibly high amount, but what they were actually pledging to do is to change their business and to actually give more loans out to minority Black entrepreneurs as well as people. And so there are two responses here, right? One is more symbolic, where, all right, we'll just donate money. And then there is actually a more substantive, where they're actually planning to change something inside the organization, which I think is one way to address this issue, right? Which is an important role that they can play, again, as value distributors here, as well as creators. Then we also looked, okay, who was more likely to make a pledge? And again, it was interesting that firms with greater Tobin skew were more likely to make a pledge. And of course, as you would expect, the longer it took for them to make that statement, the more likely they were to make that pledge. Now, and this is where the strategy lens comes in, right? But how did investors react? This is a big question, because again, if the reaction is positive, then that would be encouraging to all these companies to do more. But if it is negative, then maybe, that's a signal that investors don't see this as profit making, right? And again, that shareholder value maximization argument comes in, and that's why they don't want companies to essentially get distracted on all of these societal issues, right, of inequality in particular. So through the financial event study method, we look at essentially the reaction, the cumulative abnormal returns on the day of these statements. And we find that across all event windows, it was a consistent, statistically and economically significant negative reaction. It was about -1%, independently of who made the statement, whether it was on the organization's website or the CEO made the statement. On average, it was about -1%. I'm not going to bore you with all the robustness checks that we did, but this was a surprise to me. It wasn't to my co-author, I have to say. So I wanted to see more, like what is going on, right? What are the mechanisms for this negative reaction? And so to decompose it, we essentially did content analysis of these statements. And we found that investors reacted more positively when these statements carried more positive emotion and more mentions of we, of us, of society. But they reacted more negatively when companies were differentiating, like using but, else, no one, hasn't, etc., as well as when they made a pledge. And so again, making a pledge, that is committing financial resources to this issue, right, redistributing wealth. And so they saw this in more negative light. We also tried to see, well, what about this like activism, right, this role that companies play in these statements. And so we actually went back and coded. We used several words, several terms to code more or less activist statements among these firms. And we found that investors react more positively to less activist statements. So essentially, like very quickly in conclusion, with this increasing ideological polarization in the US and around the world, right, companies face difficult choices when it comes to these decisions. And on the one hand, it's expected more than ever for companies to take a stance on contentious social issues. But on the other hand, there are all these different audiences that might have different preferences, and it's very difficult to satisfy them all, right? And so we essentially show here that while society demands corporations not only to take a stance on racial, but also to drive real change, and only 99 of them make a pledge, and less than half of them actually make a statement. And we also find that investors react negatively, and usually that reaction means that they don't believe that these stances will lead to improved financial performance, right? So they might view it as an additional cost of running business, or maybe punishing more activist firms. And also with so many of investors themselves demanding, like BlackRock, for instance, demand long-term plans to improve diversity, equity, and inclusion at companies they invest in. There is this other initiative by institutional investors that essentially call for more action. We kind of call them out on this because on average, their reaction is negative to these statements. So last slide, Anita.
We're about 5 minutes over, just to mention, but that's okay. You want to do your last slide?
Okay, I'll go to this one. The last question that you had is how can we potentially address this, right? Like what solutions exist? And recently I had the privilege of sitting on this doctoral committee where essentially a lot of studies came to my light that I didn't know about, which kind of actually addressed different audiences in terms of inequality. But the solution that I think we need to be discussing is really through entrepreneurship, and not just entrepreneurship per se, but like as our work on business incubators together, right? Like, and as others shows, entrepreneurship could really be this vehicle, right, to overcome potentially market discrimination. And this is in the context of former inmates. It helps reduce crime and increases community integration, and it really helps even some, like the last site is really research from Southern Africa, where Johannesburg Business Incubator was providing training, but also mentoring to these disadvantaged entrepreneurs. So that could really be a way out whereby we would reduce inequality and increase growth at the same time. So I'm going to stop here. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Olga. I think there's a lot there to discuss at the end. There's for me, questions that are coming up about how redistribution, if redistribution is the answer to remediating inequality, how do these entrepreneurial firms play a role in that? So we'll come back to that after we hear from our other speakers. I'm so excited to introduce you to Sergio Lazzarini. Sergio earned his PhD at Washington University in St. Louis, and he is now the Chafi Haddad Professor of Management at INSPER Institute of Education and Research in Sao Paulo, Brazil. He is currently visiting the Rotman School of Management here at the University of Toronto, and he does his research on public and private actors, how they interact and organize their activities to improve economic and social performance. And in particular, he's the founding director of INSPER Mattresses, which is a center for the study of impact measurement and investing. And I wanted to ask you, Sergio, if you don't mind, please, just to give us some insight on what you're learning at INSPER Mattresses about this relationship, right where Olga left us. You know, how does private entrepreneurship, private engagement, perhaps by disenfranchised persons, supported by public sector actors, how does that break this trade-off? How does that help us make progress? Thank you, Sergio.
Okay, thank you so much, Anita. Thank you, Fanish, everybody. I mean, it's a pleasure to be with you here discussing those very important topics. As Anita mentioned, I have this center I run this center in Brazil called INSPER Mattresses, and I think I'll give you an example of a particular kind of project we did along those lines. We partnered with two nonprofits, Fundação Tide Setúbal and Itaú Social, to basically help the City Hall of Sao Paulo to develop this panel of indicators, and I am indicators of development, and as I'm going to explain, we use it as a kind of theory of change approach. So Sao Paulo is a very unequal city, as you know, right? I mean, all those trade-offs abound. This is an iconic photo of a luxury buildings close to a very low-income area, slum, basically, and you see this all the way around. So the city hall was concerned about this. So if the city grows, everybody, a part of the population gets rich. How can we generate a more even development in the city? And the municipality selected some areas, districts, to focus on some initial interventions. Here you have some of those areas selected by the municipality, and those numbers here indicate the percentage of the population earning the income, or per capita income would be less than half the minimum wage. So it's very low, actually. I mean, so we have poverty, inequality here. And what is interesting is that you have a district, which is a larger area, which is also poor, but then you have a territory within the district that is even more complicated. So, and from the beginning of the project, we like to approach this not only in terms of income inequality, but other types of things that create also, I mean, problems for those populations. And it became clear to us that you need to consider a whole set of problems, not only work and income, but also safety, infrastructure, education, health, mobility, housing, social capital. I mean, all those things are identified in literature as crucial, and they interact, I mean, to develop, to generate those kind of, it's kind of systemic development and deal with the trade-offs. We had we have previous work on that, and we draw from those previous studies. The UN has this very nice habitat project with metrics of indicators of development, and a lot of discussion now among urbanists, city planners on this, what it has been called social urbanism, thinking about the city development beyond physical issues, physical facilities, etc., considering social interactions. The benchmark case has been Medellin in Colombia, right? But yeah, I mean, although drawing from this previous work, we try to do this in a more grounded way. So we try to interact as much as possible with individuals living in the city. This project was developed last year, so we had the shock of COVID made our work very difficult. I mean, our interactions, but in some moments we were able to, with the help of the nonprofits, we were able to connect with those individuals living in the population. This was a meeting with them where they expressed their problems. They talked about how they see the problems in the territory, etc., etc., etc. So it was crucially important for us to talk to those individuals and then our proposed set of metrics. So basically, as I mentioned to you, we have a host of problems, right? Systemic problems. And beginning in each problem, for instance, here, health, we created a kind of initial theory of change. So theory of change, in case of you don't know, it's well known in the field of policy analysis and development. Basically, you propose a chain of causal relationships from inputs, activities, etc. For instance, in health, we can have health professionals allocated to activities in health centers or supporting families, etc. Then have outputs. I don't know the number of families that were supported, but what is really important are the outcomes, right? Whether their health improved, and also we differentiate between activity outcomes and social outcomes. And social outcomes, usually we connect those outcomes with the SDGs, the Social Development Goals, as I'm going to show you in a second. The theory, and then we integrated, we did this for every kind of theme here, crime, income, etc. And then we integrated all those theories of change. I cannot really show this, and it's really complicated. It became a giant kind of theory of change. All those things intersect. One theme of activities related to, infrastructure will also affect the ability to deal with crime or education, etc. So they all intersect. But at least we came up with this kind of map with themes mapping onto outcomes. So we had around 37 outcomes, and then we proposed a metrics. In a sense, I mean, we were inspired a lot by the experience in Medellin, where they came up with a set of similar metrics, right? And then we proposed measures on those things. Opportunities, for instance, education, income, work, entrepreneurship, quality of life, access to health, sanitation, social life and governance. I think it was something we advanced a bit in this discussion in terms of how they self-organize, how they are engaged in political decision-making, etc. It was identified as crucially important, and of course, infrastructure as well. And we linked all those indicators to the SDGs. Basically, I think we have all the SDGs here, except, I guess, life underwater or something, right, which is not applicable. But in general, we have all the SDGs here. And another innovation that we propose here is to see this kind of theory of change as a network. Why? Because theory of change is a set of actions, right, that map onto results. So it's a matrix, activities mapping onto results. And if we plug, and in those territories, there are firms operating in those territories. If we plug several organizations doing certain types of activities in theory of change, all those here balls here are organizations operating in a territory, one of those territories, then we can create a network of organizations that share common goals, right? So we can identify organizations that share common goals. For instance, all those organizations here, they are more focusing on entrepreneurship, cultural activities in the territory, etc. All those organizations here are more focused on sanitation, health. But what is interesting in this exercise is that, for instance, those two organizations, they may share a common objective, but if you ask them whether they are collaborating, in general, they are not collaborating. They are not even talking to each other. So there's an opportunity here to use this tool to show them that they have common goals so they can collaborate. So next steps now real quick. We are in the process of data collection in 2 territories to collect all those indicators. We're planning to develop an interactive tool so that policymakers, organizations can more or less click on their activities and they can see the map of their expected results. We'd like to track and compare the development of similar territories, and we will certainly keep developing and refining the theory of change in light of new conditions that we will find in those exercises. So thank you so much. I mean, it'll be a pleasure to continue talking to you about those topics.
It's so interesting. Thank you very much, Sergio. That's super helpful, and really highlights a contrasting complementary set of issues to what Olga raised. So thank you very much for that. Our third. Thank you. Our third speaker is Patrick Belzer. Patrick is senior economist and wage specialist at the International Labor Organization in Geneva. He's the coordinator of the ILO team that provides technical support to member states on wage policies. And he's also the main author of an excellent report entitled the ILO Global Wage Report, which is published every 2 years. And just came out. He's also the main author of the very recent ILO report on inequalities in the world of work, published on the occasion of the 2021 ILO conference. He owns a Doctor of Philosophy in Economics from the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex in the UK, and he's published extensively on issues related to wages and inequalities, and has edited a book on forced labor and human trafficking. Welcome, Patrick. Thank you for joining us today. You have, I'm sure, more data on wage inequality than almost anyone in the world. What are your thoughts about this challenge of trying to remediate inequality without losing growth opportunity? Can we get income growth among the bottom 40% of the population to lower the income gap between the rich and the poor and still elevate the economic condition of people, especially in poverty?
Thank you very much, Anita, for this very nice introduction and very comprehensive introduction. It's a huge question you're putting on the table here, of course, and I want to give a bit of a perspective from the work of the ILO itself. The ILO is a UN agency which. As you all know, which has a mandate to promote social justice. And so the idea of reducing inequalities and fighting inequalities is really at the heart of the mandate of the organization. It's an organization that was founded in 1919 based on the idea that social justice was a necessary ingredient and component to secure peace in the world. And so we had, after World War I and again after World War II, the illustration of how the lack of social justice and social unrest can not only destabilize countries, but actually lead to broader conflicts in the world. And so that was really the premise of the creation of the ILO. And of course, the ILO's focus is on the world of work. We are a special organization in the sense that in our decision-making bodies and in our main fora of discussion, we have not only government representatives, but we also have employers, organizations, and workers organizations, that being trade unions. And the philosophy here is the idea that it's possible to find common ground through social dialogue, through constructive discussion, whereby I think that the different policy objectives can be reconciled and maybe not so much be seen as trade-offs. And I think in particular when we're going to have a discussion at the International Labour Conference in November, December this year. So the International Labour Conference is our annual meetings, if you want. And we will have discussions and participations from governments, all the different regions, and the employers and the workers' organizations. And of course, all these different groups have different interests, but I think there is a recognition at this particular moment in time that we need a balanced economic growth, which ensures also a fair distribution of the fruits of progress to the workers and their families. And so these two components are part of the solution. We don't see them as antagonistic or as trade-offs. We think they should be included jointly in the policy objectives. And how exactly this is done is then a decision that is made at the country level, of course, by the governments in discussion with the social partners. But of course, there are always 2 or 3 major components in those strategies to address inequalities in the labor market. And here I want to say that, one point I want to emphasize is that we don't think that you reduce inequalities only through redistribution. Redistribution after the facts with fiscal redistribution, more progressive taxes. We see that actually the trend is not towards more progressive taxation in the world, but even so, there are many forms of inequalities in the labor market which needs to be addressed in the labor market. And there's vertical inequality in terms of arising from the dispersion in wages, in labor incomes. There is the problem that millions of people don't have jobs. And across the world, almost 500 million people are either unemployed or would like to work more or have dropped out of the labor force because they are discouraged. They believe they will not be able to find a job. And the pandemic, the COVID-19, has further exacerbated this problem with more than 250 million jobs, full-time equivalent jobs disappearing in 2020. And so that is one source of inequality. Then you have the situation of developing countries where unemployment is maybe not the right measure, but where you have more than 60% of the workforce working in the informal economy. That is 2 billion people working in the informal economy, where most of the time they have very low skills, very low productivity. They are not covered by any mechanisms of social security or social protection. And so that is a major source of inequality in the labor market, which resonates beyond the labor market. Gender inequality. So you have gender pay gaps. We have estimated in the Global Wage Report that women continue to earn 20% less than men on average across the world. There are countries which have much higher gender pay gaps and countries which have smaller ones, but this is a global average. And much of this gap is not due to differences anymore in skills or education levels. It's due to many other complex problems, which include discrimination in the labor market and also some measure of occupational segregation and a whole set of difficulties for women to participate in the labor markets in high-paying jobs. And so these problems must be addressed in the labor market. You're not going to address these problems through redistribution. It's not the redistribution. Redistribution is a redistribution across households, but there's an intra-household issue here, and the fundamental problem is injustice in the labor market. So what the ILO is also stands for, we have conventions and recommendations, is the elimination of all forms of discrimination in the labor market, equal opportunity, but also equal treatment, not only for women, but also for groups which continue to suffer from discrimination, not only in the labor market, but also in the labor market. And we have, let me just mention the case of indigenous and tribal peoples, who represent about 6% of the population in the world, but a much higher portion, I believe 16 or 17% of the poor. And so policies are needed to address these issues in the labor market. I think when I said there are 3 blocks, I see the block of sustainable enterprise creation, productivity growth, creation of skills for people to be able to access these jobs. The second main component being the institutions of work, which ensure that fair share of the fruits of progress to all, which is one of the way that this is being formulated in our Philadelphia Declaration adopted during the Second World War. Institutions such as collective bargaining, minimum wages, which have been very criticized, a few decades ago, but now we have a Nobel Prize, David Card, who spent part of his academic life showing that a well-thought minimum wage and a balanced or adequate minimum wage that takes into account the needs of workers and their families, but also economic factors, is having no negative impact on employment. And in fact, this is the kind of subjects that the ILO is working on a daily basis. And the unit I work in is providing policy advice to many countries across the world who want to improve or set up minimum wages. We've worked with Qatar. Qatar has adopted the minimum wage just now. It will protect the wages of the 2 million migrant workers who work there. South Africa, Namibia, many other countries are putting in place such a policy which contributes a little bit, but importantly, but is a small component of the reduction of inequalities in the labor market. So, productivity, fair share to institutions, and redistribution in the end. And redistribution, yes, very important. I don't want to minimize at all the role of redistribution. Half of the people in the world have no social protection whatsoever. So 40% of people have no health insurance. They have no access to health services. Across the world, only 20% of people have unemployment benefits. All the others have to survive in one way or another. And so universal social protection is also a key towards achieving lower inequality. And I don't know how much time I've spoken. And I had a PowerPoint presentation, but I just forgot about it.
It's perfect. Thank you, Patrick. That was exactly on time and a wonderful compliment to what we have been discussing. I have a number of questions, but before I raise them, I wanted to ask if Professor Koschak, I hope I'm saying that properly, wouldn't mind unmuting and perhaps introducing yourself and asking your questions of the panelists, please.
Sure. Thank you, Anita. Thanks. This is a great panel. Thank you to all the speakers for addressing these important issues. I was wondering if any of them have comments to share about what they think about proposals for instituting a universal basic income. So Mr. Belser mentioned that redistribution is not a solution. But he also mentioned that such policies might have positive benefits for the working peoples as well, not just for those that are unemployed. So I'm wondering what you think about the potential impacts and what the research is saying. I don't really know if there have been trials in limited locations, and wonder what scholars and practitioners think about these debates. Thank you.
Patrick, would you mind perhaps addressing that, please?
Yes, thank you very much. Very interesting question. It's a question that often comes up in debates about the future of work. We've had a commission in the ILO looking at the future of work, and with a lot of question marks about what kind of employment relationships there will be in the future, and including also thinking about people in the digital economy and other new forms of work. And so that question is very relevant. I think it's fair to say that people are divided on this issue. On the one hand, because the ILO is so much about about work, about ensuring that people have decent work, that there is a bit of a perception that maybe this discharges the governments and all of us in the world about the responsibility to provide jobs to people, jobs with incomes, with dignity, with the whole meaning that goes in jobs, and so there is a bit of resistance coming from that side. On the other hand, it is true that forms of employment are evolving, and that the idea is attractive, I believe, and I say that also at a personal level. But a lot of it is also in working out the details of it. When you have such a scheme, does it replace other social protections? Who funds it? What's the amount? And we had an initiative in Switzerland where this was put on the table for a vote for the population. And I think it's this issue of not being clear about the specifics of it, which resulted in a negative vote from people who thought, is this a dangerous thing? And next thing I know, the traditional social programs disappear, and there is a flat rate for everybody, whether we work or we don't work, or whether we have a disability or we don't have a disability. And so I think this is part of the debate. It's a debate that's going to continue. I just want to say, I didn't say that redistribution is not the answer. It has to be part of the answer, but it's not the only piece which we need to take into account in the answer.
Thank you so much, Patrick. And am I saying this right? Özgecan?
Yes, Anita, thank you. Özgecan. Yes.
Thank you. So, there's a number of questions in the chat, and in just a moment, I want to ask Heidi if she wouldn't mind asking her question, but just to reflect for a moment on several things that have been written, including by Finish. So we've got this big picture that I'm trying to make sense of here. So Olga has told us that through redistribution, it is possible to have both growth and income. And we've heard this compelling kind of argument and evidence from both Sergio and Patrick that we need the right kind of growth. We need growth that enfranchises people who haven't been enfranchised, and that both growth and inequality remediation can occur together if we have that right kind of growth. And a lot of that growth may occur outside the formal economy, and with 2 billion people in the informal economy. And there's lots of work to do of the kind that Sergio described to try to just rationalize organizational effort and coordinate it to try to really support people in those favelas who may not be in formal work, so that we reduce gender violence and other kinds of structural problems and get everybody working together. And I find that very compelling and reasonable and intuitively accessible. It leaves me, though, with a big question about whether the formal private sector really can be, a powerful agent for achieving the kind of inequality remediation and growth that the community is demanding, and rightly so. So I did want to ask you, Olga, about that. whether it's the investment community or the entrepreneurs themselves, whether it's large companies or the structure behind formal entrepreneurial companies, can we really rely on the private sector's structure to solve this problem? Or alternatively, is the structure of the private sector complicit in the inequalities that we're seeking to remediate?
I would agree with that later point, because this is essentially what I think of in our studies showing and what we're observing in practice, right? That essentially organizations are creating these inequalities, like the hiring practices is the first starting point when they start thinking about inequality and addressing inequality. I thought about entrepreneurship as a solution, not in a sense as entrepreneurial firms hiring more diverse people, for instance. I thought about it as providing economic opportunities. And I wasn't clear, I understand from the chat as questions were coming. I think, and this is why like all of this new research that uses randomized control experiments, that uses those exogenous shocks, like the study in Portugal, where essentially Portugal lowered those barriers to entry for entrepreneurs by essentially going from, I don't know, 200 days to register a business to 15 or to even like 15 minutes, right? How much lowering those, and in a staggered fashion across different sort of counties within Portugal, and really seeing this cause and effect, how much effect that had on those disenfranchised populations within Portugal and how that gave them jobs and gave them those opportunities. So similar in Southern Africa, right? Like these are all economic opportunities that people want that they may not receive. And so, yes, I don't know, private or public sector, who is the solution? Public sector certainly probably much faster so than private enterprise catching up to this. But it is certainly a big challenge of sorting that out.
Thank you, Olga. I wondered, first of all, I want to acknowledge that the question that I just asked is very heavily reflective of a point that Berku made in the chat. So thank you, Berku, for that. I wanted to ask Heidi, if you wouldn't mind, please, unmuting and asking your question. And I think it's relevant for both Sergio and Olga.
Sure. So hi, everybody. I'm Heidi. I'm a director of culture and transformation for a consumer goods manufacturer. So happy to hear this discussion today as our company, like many, are trying to figure out what our role is in this bigger picture. And my question is really to Olga. It's really trying to understand what companies have learned from this George Floyd reaction that you've studied in more depth, and trying to understand how companies are adapting to this first effort. So I wasn't sure if in your data you were able to see if there might have been a difference for companies who have already been on a social justice agenda, who took a stand, versus those that maybe this was a first time they were mentioning this topic, which might change the authenticity of that particular statement or maybe its impact. So I was curious if you had any cases where you could explain where maybe there was a more positive effect of a statement for companies that are trying to do their part.
So this is what we're working on the data currently. So we actually aggregated all of Twitter. So whenever companies made those statements on Twitter, we essentially collected all of the replies that came from the general public. And you could see some of them were very negative. Like they were calling out Walmart, for example. And I have slides to share, but I'm not going to do that. Like just calling them out. Oh yeah, you believe in equity, but then what about this and this manager and this store? And essentially like almost putting a video up as to, or hiring this lobbyist who is known, racist, but others, there were some positive responses whereby employees were actually, yes, working for this company and having a mixed race family. I can attest to the statement that this is how the company actually leads and bleeds this, right? Mm-hmm. So yes, we're actually in the process of kind of analyzing the data. Unfortunately, I don't have like all the answers right now, but it's certainly clear from those replies that companies are just much more transparent now, right? Because of social media and because of all this wealth of information sharing through those channels. So, which is exciting because they're finally accountable to all of these statements. They're not just cheap talk, right? Like they have to respond to these replies too, and then make sure that they address them. So that additional level of transparency, I think, is great to actually keep them accountable for these issues.
Thank you.
Thank you, Haiti.
Sergio, I wanted to ask you if you wanted to comment on this matter. I know this is something you've thought a great deal about.
Yeah, I mean, and Marcus has this this very nice comment on governments, right? I mean, sometimes we do not include governments as part of the equation, and especially management research. Oftentimes we embark, I mean, in this kind of view that I mean, the solution would be based on firms with their ESG kind of projects, et cetera, et cetera. I just finished a book. It will come out next year. Essentially, it's about a private engagement of organizations in activities in the public interest, if you will. I mean, with positive externalities, etc. And I mean, the conclusion. I mean, when I read the literature and my own research, is that governments are essential, because governments, they have the legitimacy to define what needs to be done. They have the scale to do it. I mean, if you consider stories of transformation of reduction in income inequality, I mean, they often come from the effort of governments, etc. And of course, firms need to understand this process. I mean, as I discussed in my presentation, private organizations often they try to do their things by themselves. They don't coordinate that effort. They don't pursue common goals. I mean, they have common goals, but they don't collaborate, and they think that they can do everything alone. And that's not true. They don't. Several organizations that I talk to, they say, I mean, I don't like governments. I don't want to mess with this kind of politics. I mean, but you should. if you're interested in impact at a scale, I mean, at least you should talk to this actor, right? I mean, so I think this is it is crucially important. I think that we need a more balanced view of those things, bringing governments to the equation and understanding how companies can also contribute.
I mean, Finish has some great remarks here. Finish, did you want to comment as well?
I'm happy to expand on a couple of things that were going through my mind. One was that it seems quite clear that many of us think organizations, particularly business organizations, have a role to play in solving some of the challenges we're talking about, but it looks like their shareholders don't agree with us. So the question is, how do we get past that? And is this just a temporal phenomenon? People will change their minds and investors will have a different mindset in a few years. Maybe CEOs need to tell the story better about why this is in the interest of shareholders too in the long run. Or maybe we don't care. I mean, shareholders are just one set of stakeholders. But that seems to be one important kind of class of issues to think more about. The other is, I was intrigued by Marcus's comment about maybe it's not all about business organizations. Governments are really the primary responsible party here. But then I wonder, what role do we play as management scholars or design scholars in helping governments improve their capacity to deal with these problems? Are these even management problems, or are these straightforward public policy or politics type issues? So these are the two questions.
Thank you. And Neil, I wonder if you could chime in here with offer your thoughts, please.
Happy to. Hi, everybody. I'm in Chicago. Yeah, as I listened to Sergio and these others, I kept, in my mind, I kept hearing either or. Is this a government issue? Is this a private sector issue? And it's clearly not. It clearly is an and issue. And, you know, I work in the non-for-profit I co-founded. It's all about how do we get the business ecosystem engaged, so that recognize it's an ecosystem. To get to Sergio's point, if they're not talking to each other, they're competing. They may not have even thought of themselves that way. And to recognize, to Phoenicia's last comment, when I hear Larry Fink talk, you know, businesses have to be worried about this stuff or they're going out of business. The money pouring into sustainable development funds is huge. So there's so much pressure now, I think, on the private sector to think differently, the pressure to reimagine capitalism. And I think the only solution to this will come from taking that ecosystem perspective. And how do we as designers find innovative ways to help the ecosystem connect to itself in generative dialogues, understanding the value each member needs to derive from this perspective and the impact it's having on the ecosystem, the broader ecosystem, the planet. So I think how can we create new dialogues involving the right people, recognizing we all have a role to play, and to recognize, yes, private sector still needs to return shareholder profit. It's not either or. And they need to worry about the planet, and they need to worry about customers, and they need to worry about communities. That can be scary in some regard, but I actually think it's fairly simple, and we know how to bring people together to have generative dialogue. So I'm hopeful and a little scared.
Marcus, I wonder if you agree with that. Are you hopeful? How are you doing on that?
Hi. Sure. No, I think I'm just naturally hopeful, but so yeah, I would certainly, I think I agree with pretty much everything that's been said about how both the government and the private sector have big roles, how they need to work together much more. I guess maybe just the quick contribution I'd want to make is a bit of a pet issue I have, which is we need more impact evaluation, more data to go into our design thinking about future work. And governments somewhat predictably are a little bit resistant to really rigorous research about the impact of what they do. What's been most shocking to me, I think, as I've been paying attention to this space over the last few years, is learning how resistant the private sector is to evaluation of its own efforts. So it's been very exciting to see this initial scratching of the surface with ESG stuff. But I mean, I guess I somewhat wonder, is some of the negative market reaction because investors are smart and they know it's not particularly genuine yet, and that the data that exists so far is pretty fake, yeah, it just does not have a lot of substance to it. But again, back to sort of my surprise, or at least to frame it more positively, my sense of where there should be hope is that the private sector is all about experimenting and testing their new ideas when it matters. In all their operations, private companies do really, really rigorous research in their R&D. They just absolutely refuse to do it in this new space of supposedly really, really caring about impact. So it feels like we're on the verge, hopefully, of some companies distinguishing themselves by doing that. But I also don't think that still surprisingly hasn't happened yet.
Thank you so much, Marcus. I know we're going to lose Patrick in just a few minutes. So Patrick, I wondered if you wanted to comment on this, and then I am excited to turn back to our other panelists as well, because I know that they've done work in this area.
Thank you, Anita. Yes, I mean, for me, it's very interesting to hear this discussion about is the government important or not. I'm in an organization where the member states are represented mostly by governments, and for them, governments is the center. So it's kind of unusual for me to be in a discussion where the question is, do we need governments at all? And so, to me, it is so obvious that there is a need to work together on this. It's interesting to see that maybe this is not so obvious actually.
Yeah.
But we have many examples where, let's say, I mean, I'm not sure how relevant this example is to this discussion, but I think it is. There is no minimum wage in Ethiopia. There's a lot of companies producing textile and garments and other products and flowers, etc., in Ethiopia. And when the issue of wages is discussed, and the fact that some of these wages are very low, and there is increasingly negative press about these low wages of some of these producers there, they turn to us or the government and say, okay, we are prepared to increase wages, but we don't want to be alone here. And so we need the government. We need the government to create a level playing field, because we, as a single company, we don't want to be at a competitive disadvantage if we unilaterally increase our wages. And so I see this is an example of a natural need for collaboration. And then anything linked to redistribution is, of course, also a form of collaboration, if you wish, because it's the issue of taxation and how the taxes are being used. Maybe this is part of a broader policy dialogue. But enterprises, many local enterprises are affiliated to employers' organizations through which they can make their voices heard at the national level or even at the international level and engage in a discussion with governments. And of course, some of the big companies may not be members of employers' associations, but I would invite them to become members. And for multinational corporations, it's a bit more complicated, but there is an institutional channel here. And as we're talking institutions and the role of enterprises and institutions, I think the institutions for the collaborations do exist. I must say though, at current times, the discussion is sometimes very polarized. It's not an easy time for a good social dialogue. There is social dialogue, but it's sometimes rough. But it's dialogue, and I think the channels are there, and that's what we need.
Thank you. Let me turn to Sergio and then Olga, and then Ozkan, I think you also might have a comment here. Sergio?
Yeah, no, it's just real quick, commenting on what Fanish said about managers and policymakers. I'll report one experience that I had. One of my research projects is on social impact bonds, right? Contracts designed by governments where they reward private investors and operators according to measurable indicators of performance. Those things are becoming really common in the world. And we have a paper we submitted for initial kind of feedback. It's submitted to an editor of a top journal. And the editor said that this is not a paper for strategy because policymakers are not managers, basically. And then they said, oh, come on. I know several of those policymakers, they design contracts, they basically deal with problems, they deal with people. How come they're not managers? I don't see the difference. And if we're talking about governments, there's this paradox. Governments are important, but they are they are not effective. Several times they're corrupt, etc. There's lack of accountability. But I don't really see a better opportunity for us to contribute in organizational design topic, right? In public bureaucracies, etc. With an opportunity to generate impact at a scale, actually. So, I myself am embarking in this kind of research.
Olga.
Yeah, I was mentioning research that shows that once we actually align the incentives for executives, right? So once we have those goals, and I've seen companies do that where they look at the SDGs and then they pick a couple they can address, and they actually essentially have them in the decision-making process, right? Whenever they adopt any new innovation, any new project or initiative, they actually try and only choose those that help them achieve those goals. And similar with executive compensation packages, again, speaking of solutions, if they are in there, if those goals are in there to achieve whether it's health and safety or inequality, say, right, then we see much more action. And actually that action then has an effect also on financial performance, as that paper that I put in the chat shows. How do we get there? So I know Paul and Neil were suggesting ways how to align these incentives within the ecosystem, but that's where the devil is always in the details, right? Is how to actually get there.
Yeah, and how to get there fast enough, right? How to make and at scale, because some of these problems are so urgent. Ozkan, I know you've done work in this domain. Would you mind just please unmuting and offering your perspective?
Oh, I don't really have much work that I myself have done. I was actually going to ask a question that Patrick later alluded to about governments acting as collaboration points and helping everybody elevate and overcome their fear of being the one at the losing end of social policies being implemented or of being taken advantage of by free riders. So just before he made his comment, I had this question that we were at that time having this discussion about local and national governments and their role in this compared to private organizations. And I was thinking, well, of course, governments are great for representing the interests of non-shareholder stakeholders, but among governments is that issue of coordination that's especially with multinational and transnational organizations fleeing to tax havens and avoiding paying taxes and leveraging the competition in governments on their own behalf and their shareholders' behalf. So I was wondering, maybe there are some design issues there that perhaps can be some learning to be extracted from lower levels of analysis and applied at that global level. What have we learned from the local level in governments being able to bring different stakeholders together and different parties together and agree on some minimal standards that can be implemented and applied at the global level with organizations like the ILO, getting governments as well as transnational organizations, multinational companies to agree on some minimal standards across the board that can be implemented globally.
Thank you very much. And I agree with everything that everyone has said, and yet I'm also still worried that many companies are greenwashing, or I don't know what the right word is, but they're, I'm very compelled by some of the research that's been discussed that organizations are waving their hands, but with the investors, so measurement is not going to be enough. There are firms out there, not all firms, certainly there's great diversity, but some firms that actually sincerely profit so much from the structural inequalities that are embedded in their systems that they cleverly and through the kinds of high profile jobs and highly remunerative jobs seek to hire very talented people who can basically overwhelm public servants and the governments in controlling their behavior. And how do we deal with that? We need we need graduated and multifaceted ways to intervene through government, right? How do we get there? I don't know, Patrick, do you have any thoughts?
I think Sergio was going to volunteer. I can see him. He was raising his hand. Over to you, Sergio. I think this one is too difficult.
It's too difficult. Okay. Sergio, never one too shy from difficulty.
No, yeah, I mean, we kind of have some hints, like public administration scholars are examining this. I mean, so we know that there's this sort of shared leadership, political participation, accountability. I mean, we have several dimensions, but what I'm really intrigued is what is the origin of those things? Why has any government improved its accountability? So that's a question that is on my mind right now. I mean, there are stories of bureaucratic transformation throughout the world. I mean, it seems to me that several of those good bureaucracies that we see, I mean, it's almost random. It's because there was a leader who appeared and this guy wanted to transform. And I mean, there are several types of stories, but I myself, I'm struggling to find a common answer to this. And it is one of the most difficult problems that I can think of in terms of organizational design, right? Organizational change.
Olga, did you want to comment? Oh, here.
Yeah, I was thinking about another research that I work on, where essentially we look at all kinds of criticisms of companies on ESG issues that come from social media, traditional media, where media is that watchdog and essentially calling out firms for what they're doing. And what we observe is that firms actually respond more, like do more about these issues when they see their peers being criticized in the news. So direct criticism of these peers may not actually generate more action from the peers, from those focal companies, but like the peers observing this criticism may actually do more. So maybe more media criticism.
Yeah, absolutely. And activism, right? Activist criticism also, as you noted in your concluding remarks. There's a great chat going on, and I just want to ask if Paul or Neil or Marcus wanted to give voice to some of the ideas that they're putting in the chat. Paul, we haven't heard from you. Are you, I don't know if Paul's still with us. Paul, are you there?
Yeah, I'm still here, and I agree with most everything that's being said, and am observing that the ecosystem, the operating model is changing, and that there are firms reacting and governments reacting, and a realization creeping in some instances and transformational in others, that the environment has changed, and that there is an imperative to address issues in ways that many corporations have been successfully ignoring to date.
Thank you. Marcus, Neil, did you want to jump in?
I don't think I have anything super substantive to add. I just, maybe I'll say what I wrote in the chat about how just the East Asian miracle, I think, is an interesting thing to look at in terms of how it was, one of our most impressive extended sustained period of growth in a particular part of the world. And its sort of unique feature that I think made it sustainable was how, the minimum standards were being raised across the board, across health and all sorts of different factors. And many people have argued about why it succeeded. And, ultimately we just call it a miracle. And I think Stiglitz's comment about how the true miracle is that you had public policy people really foregoing self-interest, at least to some degree, and focusing on this lifting up of the bottom.
It's a little bit of an asymmetric criticism, right? Because I guess it's legitimate for private sector people to pursue their own interests, but maybe not public sector servants. One of the areas of my own work is in examining how individuals move between sectors and how they exploit some of that experience. In particular, we've been thinking a little bit about how professional accountants working for public accounting firms are often rewarded with partnerships after they take a 2 or 3 year leave to go work for a public agency, such as the Securities Exchange Commission in the United States, and then return to those auditing firms armed with detailed knowledge of the internal systems of the federal authorities, and that they are rewarded with sometimes $1 million partnerships that are extremely remunerative and consequential. It's an enormous, I think, challenge to try to think about, to try to catch up in our tools of analysis in the organizational design community, to catch up with the reality of the ways in which some actors in the private sector navigate the boundary between the private and public governance systems to their personal and corporate advantages. Not that I'm worried. I'm hopeful, but concerned, I would say. So,
Anita, sorry.
Neil, pardon me. Did you have a quick comment? I wanted to ask for.
Yeah, just real quick, because it's easy for this conversation to spiral downward because there is a lot of nasty shit in the world. And I think we need to find ways to raise up those exemplars. I mean, I look at there's a big workshop going on right now that David Cooperrider is leading, the Great Leadership Reset, looking at where are businesses flourishing, where are they contributing to a better world. And I think we do ourselves a disservice by focusing and highlighting only the greenwashing companies, only those negative. Where are those positive examples? Because that's what we want people thinking about. That's what we want to recognize. That's what we want to lift up. So that's it.
I agree. I think I would say that we need to do both. We need to interrogate so Venetia, I'm going to turn to you in just a moment if you don't mind, but here's what I want to say. As someone who kind of grew up in this system that I've just described, it's legitimate. It's not secret. It's absolutely viewed as, you know, appropriate and part of the system for partners and audit firms to take a tour through public service. It's laudable that it's a public, it's a rotation as a public servant. But this happens all the time, by the way, also in the military sector, private military and security companies, with people who move into the public sector. And there are tremendous potential social benefits of this with really talented individuals and committed people who are committed to public service, really achieving a kind of deeper understanding of what the rules and regulations are. There's nothing illegal happening here, but it is a facet of the system that can really amplify inequality, not because of anything sinister, but because of the structure of the system. So it is those structural problems that I think we need to also have in our sights. Excuse me for speaking. Finish?
Oh, no, not at all, Anita. I think I agree entirely with everything you're saying. And Marcus made this very useful observation that a forum like this is a good place to bring together these two opposing views, right? That there are some people who are just very interested in pointing out all the wrongs that corporates are doing, and thank God for them. But then we also have people interested in kind of highlighting the interesting success cases. And we need to make sure both sides talk to each other. I know, for instance, that some of the consulting companies like BCG and McKinsey, when they hire our students from, they actually, I think it's almost mandatory in some parts of the world. They have to spend some time pro bono consulting work for local NGOs and nonprofits. This is just part of the path to becoming partner. There's no way you can get out of it. And I think that's a good move. But the one you described about the auditors going into loopholes in the system, that had me worried a bit. But I guess we can strike a balance between these.
Yes, certainly. So thank you all for this conversation, and thanks especially to the panelists. I want to give you each just the last word before we wind down. Patrick, I know you have to leave in just a moment. Did you want to say a final thought?
Well, I wanted to thank you very much for inviting me to this discussion. I thought it was a very interesting and very good format for a discussion. I think it's a discussion that is a bit different from the type of discussion we usually have in the ILO, so it's very refreshing for me. And I've learned a lot, and I like this open discussions and the way you've been moderating this, Anita. And so, you know, congratulations and thanks very much for having me.
Big thanks to you, Patrick. Sergio.
Thank you so much, Anita, for organizing this. Finish everybody for your presence. I mean, it was great, and it was interesting to see ideas emerging for future discussions. I look forward to it, like you know, the role of governments or positive versus negative corporate examples. I mean, those things are really, really important. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
And of course, Olga.
I'm really excited about all of like this community, the organizational design people, to actually maybe provide solutions to really like this, maybe inspire them to go and research what would be a great solution for whether it's private or public sector firm, right? Like how can we address this? And the answer might be in practice already, like Neil was calling out, like there are some companies we need to highlight and then others maybe omit, but I think the solution is just around the corner. We just need to get our hands dirty. So go.
That's a wonderful note of optimism. Thank you, everyone. I want to ask Manish if he could close us off by just reminding us when the organization Design Community Conference will be later this month and how we can learn more about it. And I also want to invite you all on November 18th at the same time to a second conversation that we will be having around climate impact and systemic ways of approaching innovation and organizational design to accomplish some of the sustainable development goals around climate. Over to you, Finish. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita. So before I say anything about the conference, let me just thank you also for assembling this amazing team and moderating a great session. I think I learned a lot about these themes. As Anita has mentioned, we have an annual conference for the organizational design community. This year's theme is about platforms, ecosystems, and meta-organizations. So essentially think about it as a collection of ideas about inter-organizational design. So the design of relationships between freestanding organizations. And this is being run by Vasudeva from University of Minnesota and Tobias Kretschmer from LMU. The conference is primarily for ODC members, but I do believe we have a few slots usually open to as well. So Ruchika, if I can request you to put a link to the conference in our, thank you, excellent, it's there. And I think it's just about a week away from now, and it spreads over 2 days. So all the details are in that link, and I'm interested, you can join us. Thank you.
Please take care, everyone. Thank you very much.